Hello everybody, welcome back to CNS Corvettes in beautiful sunny Sarasota, Florida. It's your Corvette buddy Lyle here to talk to you about more interesting, exciting Corvette stuff. Today, we're doing one of my favorite things and we are digging into some Corvette specific history. So strap in and let's learn about the history of the ZR1. Now, when most people think about the ZR1, they think about the first ZR1 in 1990 with the LT5 and yeah, that wasn't the first ZR1. A lot of Corvette aficionados who are really into the hobby know that there actually was an option package called ZR1 in 1970, 71, and 72. So let's back up a little bit. GM exited all forms of racing in 1963, and they started to continually dampen down the racified cars that they would offer to the public. Now, they had plans after the L88 was all done and they didn't have that big block aluminum engine anymore. They wanted something that was still going to be a potent performance package without a bunch of extra frills. So this was a car that was designed to be as light and as competent on the track as it was on the road, and that meant that a lot of the things that you would get in a normal Corvette simply weren't even options. What I mean by that is they had the LT1 370 horse small block that was a really competent engine. It was a great track motor and loved to rev, and it did a great job in competitive environments. They packaged that into a car that had a lot of things added to it for performance, but subtracted for weight, i.e. things that were added. You had the cold air hood, which actually took air from the rear near the windshield and fed it to the engine rather than relying on the hot engine air under the hood to cool the engine. You had a bigger radiator. You had a steel fan shroud. You had the famous M22 Rock Crusher transmission. You had transistor ignition, power brakes, stiff shocks and springs, plus front and rear anti-roll bars, although there are a couple of those cars that evidently were made without them at the buyer's request, but most of them had front and rear anti-sway bars, right? That all makes sense for a performance car. Here's what you didn't get. These were things you could not get if you choose the ZR1 option. No air conditioning, no rear defroster, no power steering, no PO2 wheel covers. Now, here's a picture of a PO2 wheel cover, and I will tell you precisely why they weren't on any kind of performance car, because they weighed about 11,000 pounds apiece, and if they came off while you were cornering at a racetrack and went into the crowd, they'd have decapitated 4 people. They were really heavy, nasty pieces. They also had no alarm system and no factory radio. The radio delete. So those were things you didn't get on this car, and they had a $1,000 upcharge on it. In 72, they offered the same package, but they also added what they called the ZR2 package, which was the same idea, but with a 454 big block in it. And that was made for even more power, although arguably it didn't handle as well because of that heavy weight up on top of the front axle. Not many of these cars were made. Less than 60 ZR1s ever left the factory in 70, 71, and 72 combined. So today they are worth a lot of money. And a lot of people weren't willing to pay the $1,000 upcharge on a car that had, well, a whole lot less in it. Now, Porsche's perfected that 30, 40 years later, but back then, people wanted more for their money. It was very important that GM was actually trying to sneak through some dedicated performance stuff for people who actually wanted to race their cars. And we'll see how that pans out later on as we move into later iterations of the ZR1. So now we leave the early 70s, go through the early 80s, all the way to 1990, when GM introduced the brand new 1990 ZR1. Now, this car was quite a departure from the normal C4 Corvette. It had custom doors, custom quarter panels, custom rockers, a custom rear bumper cover that featured those 4 square taillights that in that 1 year only were only available on the ZR1. And that's how you could tell a real ZR1 until 1991 when they put them on every Corvette. Yeah. Anyhow, all of that extra special body work was to cover up those giant rear tires. They had 315 series tires on the back to put down the torque produced by the LT5 engine. Now, this was a real departure for GM and really at that point any American automaker, because this was an aluminum block dual overhead cam setup and 4 cams, 32 valves, and was basically a European supercar engine designed in cooperation with Lotus and produced by, of all people, Mercury Marine. And at its outset, it produced 375 horses, 370 foot-pounds of torque. But in '93, they bumped that power up to 405 horses and 385 torque with some valve train updates. Now, the interesting thing about the ZR1 was that it was the fastest car in the world at that time. That doesn't mean it was the quickest car in the world. Until you got into the higher rev ranges, the LT5 was actually the same speed, or maybe you had a little less grunt off the line than the LT1. Where the ZR1's engine shined was in the top end. This car would do 180, 190 miles an hour, and it could do it all day long. If we had an Autobahn here in America, this would have been the car that you wanted to be driving in the early 90s. There were only 6,922 of these cars produced during their production run from 1990 all the way through 1995 when they ceased production. Those cars, while they do have collector value, unless they're super, super low mile examples like museum pieces, they're still pretty attainable. You can find a C4 ZR1 in nice condition for under 35 grand any day of the week if you really look. And if you're ever interested in having a real piece of GM and Corvette history, the ZR1's an excellent choice. Just be prepared. Specifically, if you need parts for that engine, they're going to be very hard to come by. The rest of the car, a lot of it is regular C4. That LT5 engine was very special, and there aren't a whole lot of those pieces left. We now leave the mid-1990s and we fast forward all the way to 2009. Now, in 2008, GM had introduced the LS3 engine in the base model Corvette. It's still one of the most competent, well-built engines that GM has ever built. And everybody who wants to play with a GM V8 knows the LS3 is the right choice. Well, they had something special up their sleeve going into 2007, 2008. They had a car under development that was nicknamed the Blue Devil. And this thing was going to be a world-class supercar, and it was going to bear the Corvette name. Featured in that car was the supercharged 6.2-liter LS9 engine. Now that would push this car to over 190 miles an hour. It boasted 638 horses and 604 torque. This car was specially tuned for the track and to be the baddest car on the block. It had a specially tuned Tremec TR6060 6-speed manual, carbon ceramic brakes and magnetic selective ride control. And as a first for GM, it had a carbon fiber roof, a carbon fiber hood, fenders, front splitter, rocker moldings, all kinds of very heavy use of carbon fiber, which today we look at and go, well, yeah, it has carbon fiber. But in 2009, that was race car stuff. You didn't see that on anything but the exotics. So to have it on America's sports car was a big step forward and really, really cool. They also featured a lot of blue highlights, like the brake calipers were painted blue. You had a polycarbonate window in the carbon fiber hood where you could see the blue, the supercharger. It was a very competent car. And what's funny is, in the years after that, so that they made, how many of these things? 4,684 ZR1s between 2009 and 2013. They would have made a lot more, but we had that huge economic downturn in like 2011, and they went from making 1,600 a year to like 400 a year or 800 a year because people just didn't have any money. In the years after that, the value of that car kind of did this, especially with the C7 coming out. Oh, and then the C7 Z06. So the C6 ZR1 kind of continued to drop. And there was a period of time where you could buy a nice C6 ZR1 for not much more than 50 grand. And now a nice ZR1 is back up to 80, 90, or 100 grand because they are that special. They didn't make that many of them. It's an extremely competent car. And I would argue one of the best looking Corvettes ever made. So that was a huge step forward. Fast forward 10 years later, and in 2019, GM decided they were going to outdo themselves from the C6 ZR1 and introduce the C7 version of the ZR1. Sticking true to that supercharged V8, they introduced a one-year only model, the 2019 ZR1. This car had a 6.2 liter LT5. It is not the same engine that was in the C4 ZR1, but it was called the LT5. The GM does that a lot. You follow these videos, you'll hear it often. Mounted on top of that giant V8 was a 2.6 liter Eaton supercharger, and it was fed by a dual injection fuel system. Now, 2.6 liters, that's larger displacement than most of the cars that GM is making today. Blake, our lead tech, just bought a 2020 CT5 Cadillac that's gorgeous. I mean, this thing is just evil looking. It's got a 2-liter engine in it. The supercharger, just the supercharger on the C7 ZR1 had more displacement. That gives you an idea of how much air this thing was huffing. 755 horses, 715 torque. That's the most powerful production front engine Corvette that was ever made. And it came in two basic package options. You could get the Pratt & Miller setup that had chassis mounted rear wing, front splitter and front underbody splitter, or the ZTK performance package that had Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tires, chassis, magnetic selective ride control settings that also affected the chassis, a higher, bigger rear wing that was fixed, and carbon fiber front splitter end caps, which that ZTK package together translated into 950 pounds of downforce. I mean, you're approaching serious race car levels of downforce there. And honestly, about the only place you can really use that car is either on an empty road in Montana on a really beautiful day or on a racetrack, because that thing was just an absolute beast. And if, you know, those cars were $115,000, $118,000 when they were new, they're now bringing, especially the coupes with the manuals, are bringing $200,000 or more. So if you got one in 2019, you did really well and you've got a valuable car. Total production on the C7 ZR1 was only 2,953 units. So if you want one and you got 200 grand, good luck. And finally, that brings us up to today, 2025. We see the introduction, as you all know, of the C8 ZR1. And as crazy C4, C6, and C7 ZR1s were, they're nothing compared to the craziness involved with this car. If you guys watch Corvette videos, I'm sure you know all of the information already. 1,064 horses, 828 torque, 233 mile an hour top speed, 233. 0 to 60 in 2.3 seconds, and 9.6 seconds in the quarter mile at 150 miles an hour. You know, it wasn't that long ago. I'm old enough to remember when the first Fast and the Furious movie came out, and Dom Toretto, a 10-second car, and he had to go through all kinds of crazy mods to get this car to be a 10-second car. Well, now you can go buy one that's 4/10 faster than that by just writing a check. You don't have to build anything. The engine in this car is called the LT7, and basically it is the engine out of the C8 Z06 with two gigantic turbochargers strapped to it. Flat plane crank, 8-speed dual clutch, just like the regular car. Improved aerodynamics that has the highest produced downforce out of any production Corvette ever, where it just, I mean, it looks like a GT3 car. It is truly unbelievable for an American street car. Some of the things they've added to this are just very race car. You know, you got the flow-through hood and the ground effects, carbon fiber side inlets paired with new brake cooling ducts, all of which allow better engine cooling while also maximizing the space for air intakes. The ZR1 carbon fiber aero package allows for carbon wing, underbody strakes, and carbon fiber dive planes which allow for insane downforce. They also have available 10-spoke carbon fiber wheels, which, man, if you ever nick one, oh, it's going to be expensive, but boy, are they light and do they look cool. The undercarriage is completely covered to minimize drag and turbulence. You can also get the 1LZ Coupe starting price for $173,000, while convertibles are $183,300, all the way up to the top of the line 3LZ Coupe at $184,300 and convertibles at $194,300. You and I both know no one's ever going to get one of those cars at anywhere near that money. GM has said they're not going to limit production, so it's not going to be artificially a hard-to-get car, but I promise that they're not going to have a bunch of them sitting on dealer lots waiting for sale. So they are going to build as many as people ask for, I would imagine, and a certain handful to go to their top dealers. But I imagine these cars are going to command a ridiculous premium. But you're talking about a car that you can spend $175,000 to $225,000 on that is going to outperform the McLaren P1, the Ferrari LaFerrari, the Porsche 918. I mean, these cars were the holy trinity just a decade ago, and now America has come out with a car that surpasses them for basically 1/8 of the price of what those cars are worth. So that concludes our review of the ZR1 up to this point. Now, we know the Zora is coming, and it's not going to be a ZR1, but it's going to be even crazier. And while we don't have a whole lot of details about that car yet, I'm sure it is going to blow our minds with all-wheel drive, probably 1,300 horses, and a sticker price that makes the C8 ZR1 look affordable. And I can't wait to see how that happens. I hope you enjoyed our review of this. Special thanks to Tony for all of the hard work and research he did in pulling up all these pictures and stuff to go over C3 through C8 ZR1 history. I've enjoyed going through it with you. Talk to you soon.